The gurney burst through the doors like a storm finally finding land. Blood shimmered under the fluorescent lights, a thin red river tracing from the man's hairline to the crook of his neck. And at the foot of the stretcher, a woman in an evening dress, bare shoulders, trembling hands pressed forward with a voice that shook the room. "Don't let him die. Don't you dare let him die." For a suspended second, all the usual sounds of a Friday night, a monitor's chirping, wheels skittering, curtains swishing, fell into a hush around that plea, like a city remembering prayer after forgetting it for years. Then the motion returned. Nurses shouting vitals, a respiratory therapist sliding in with an ambu bag, the trauma team coalescing with the muscle memory of 100 bad nights. "Doctor?" Ethan Reyes caught the rails with one palm and took the lead with the cool, clipped cadence that meant he had already given himself to the case. 32-year-old male. Unrestrained passenger, highway rollover, hypotensive en route, GCS-7, airway compromised, pupils unequal, let's move, now. The woman tried to follow into Trauma 1, but the door swung shut on her shoulder, and she stared at the opaque glass the way one stares into a grave no one has prepared you to see. She was recognized in whispers before she was recognized in mercy. The necklace, the posture, the hair that always looked like a stylist had blessed it even in the rain. Helena Vale, daughter of Adrian Vale, a last name that could buy a hospital wing or bulldoze a neighborhood depending on where the camera was pointed. She had been photographed stepping out of cars that cost more than most homes, but here she was barefoot, heels abandoned in a smear of diesel and glass, the hem of her dress salted with road grit, mascara melted into storm water around her eyes. A security guard hovered, waiting for orders that had not yet been spoken. A charge nurse reached for the clipboard, softening her voice in that practiced way, asking who the patient was to her. And Helena said something that left the nurses blinking and the guard briefly human again. "He's mine, he's my whole life, and no one knows it." Inside, the man's chest rose with a stubborn, ragged logic, like someone fighting through a dream they did not choose. Ethan worked with a speed that had nothing to do with panic and everything to do with love for the craft. Intubation in one motion. A glance at the monitor, a frown at the narrow QRS that told a different story than the blood pressure suggested, a hand pressed to the abdomen to feel the hollow drumbeat of internal bleeding. The team moved in their orbit around him. Cumula, the nurse who could start in for in a stone. Mike, the respiratory therapist murmuring numbers like a rosary. Farah, the junior resident who looked every day like medicine had chosen her back. They were a choir of coordination and quiet ferocity, and yet somewhere in that music Ethan heard Helena's plea echo through the door, an undertone worsening with the seconds. When he stepped back for a heartbeat and scanned the man's face, he did what good doctors hate to do. He imagined a story. Not the story of his injuries, those were already writing themselves in bruises and bleeds, but the human story that makes the difference between treating a case and treating a life. Helena paced the corridor with a hunger that wasn't hunger, a thirst that wasn't thirst, a need that couldn't be satisfied with water or food because it was for time, the one resource she had never needed to purchase before. She had grown up in boardrooms that trained a person to make a crisis look like a calendar item, but there, under the sodium glare of hospital light, she was simply a woman who had just watched the car spin like a coin and land on its edge. Someone from public relations appeared. How do they always appear this fast? And asked if she wanted a private room, if they should prepare a statement just in case, if she would like discretion protocols activated to keep out the press. Helena wanted only the word stable, a word that meant tomorrow would still be a place she could drive to. When the charge nurse asked for the man's name for the chart, Helena's mouth trembled around the syllables as if speaking them would rip a seam open. "Mateo," she said, and then after a pause that was heavier than most lives, she added his last name and swallowed the rest, swallowed the impulse to say husband. To say we promised each other the most ordinary vows in a world that worships irony, to say my father will burn this city before he lets me choose an ordinary life. In Trauma 1 the ultrasound painted a dark lake where no such lake should be. Blood pooling in the abdomen, quick and ancient as a storm. Ethan's voice sharpened. "Massive transfusion protocol. Call the OR, find me a surgeon who owes me a favor." He thought of how many times he had walked families through outcomes, that delicate calculus of truth and hope, and he disliked that somewhere inside him a narrative had clicked into place the moment Helena's face appeared in the doorway. People like that didn't come alone. They came with shadows. They came with contracts. They came with the kind of power that forces physicians to spend 10 minutes fighting the clock and another 10 fighting the phone calls. He hated himself for thinking it, and he hated that experience had earned him the right to be wary. Helena remembered a chapel in a small town where no one knew her last name, and the thrill of anonymity felt like moral permission. The pew smelled of lemon oil and old promises, and Matteo's shirt had been 2 shades too light for the rented suit, and she had never liked anything more than she liked the simplicity of his yes. He was not a suit or a headline. He was stubborn and kind, and he carried himself like men who do heavy work and sleep deeply. He fixed things, not for a story, but because broken things made him restless. He liked engines that responded to gentle hands, and he had responded to hers like an engine that had finally been tuned. She had said they would tell her father when the right time came, as if time could be invited like a guest to a polite dinner. She had believed they had time. It was the most ordinary and expensive mistake. Ethan stepped into the hall to speak to her when the OR pager thrummed against his hip. He expected practiced composure, but what he found was a kind of rawness that medicine teaches you to respect. He explained what they knew and what they feared, the controlled chaos of the next hour, the risks that recited themselves like poetry no one wants to hear. He kept it clinical but kind, and he watched language do its limited best to hold a person together. Helena listened with the intensity of someone memorizing a map in a burning house. She asked good questions, the kind that tell a physician the person in front of them is not bracing for platitudes but reaching for truth. She did not say who she was to the man. She did not flash a name like a badge. She asked if she could see him for 5 seconds before they took him upstairs, and Ethan weighed the seconds the way an engineer weighs load on a bridge. 5 seconds could be nothing, and they could be everything. He nodded. She stood by the bed and took his hand the way a person takes communion. The endotracheal tube lifted his taped lips, his eyelashes were clumped with blood. She told him softly that he didn't owe life anything more than this breath and the next. She told him she was here. It wasn't a speech. It was a thread she was throwing across a canyon, hoping it would catch on something she could not see. Camilla looked up briefly and then down again, turning away with the polite blindness of those who do the most intimate work for strangers. When they began to move, Helena let go because you must, and the doors split, and the stretcher sailed through. In the elevator, Ethan stared at the monitor and the rhythm stared back, a stubborn normalcy that refused to explain the falling pressure. He thought of the list in his head: spleen, liver, mesenteric tears, pelvic bleed, war inside a body that does not want war. He asked Farah to call interventional radiology as a backup. He preferred scalpels to catheters when time had been stolen, but you keep more than one door open when a house is burning. He realized, embarrassingly late, that the woman back there was Helena Vale. The name slid into his awareness like a blade into fabric, clean and inevitable. He felt the old irritation rise. Richness arrives with demands or with apologies, and both are exhausting, and then he deflated it with a single private admonition: there is a man on this table who would like to see a second sunrise, and the rest is noise. Back in the waiting area, a cluster had already formed like weather. A hospital administrator with a soothing voice and fireproof emails. A PR director with a phone that never slept. A security team scanning entrances with eyes that could calculate angles and shame. And then, as if conjured by rumor itself, Adrian Vale, who wore money the way some men wear their sin, visible to everyone except themselves. He did not run, because men like him do not run, but he moved with a speed that outran grace. He took in the scene, found his daughter, and did not embrace her. He demanded a status update. Helena looked at him, as if she were seeing a picture of herself 20 years later and struggling to forgive it. She said the man's name again, Matteo, and her father repeated it with an unfamiliarity that crawled over her skin. For a breathless moment, she considered the geometry of lies. How many could she stack and still keep the structure from falling? And what would be crushed beneath it when it did? When Ethan returned to the hallway for signatures and logistics, he found himself standing between a father who could buy the hospital and a daughter who might tear it down for love. He explained the consent for emergent surgery in a tone that belonged to everyone and to no one. The administrator tried to insert himself as surrogate decision-maker. The family wishes the most conservative approach, but Helena stepped forward with a steadiness that came not from lineage but from having been broken open. Her voice did not waver when she said that if conservative meant slower, then conservative meant cruel. She signed with the hand that had learned the shape of her new name months ago in a chapel no one in this room had ever seen. She did not show the ring she wore on a chain under her dress. She did not ask permission to be who she already was. And as she finished the last stroke of the pen, a code was called overhead, not his, not yet, but it fractured the moment anyway, because hospitals speak in alarms when they want to remind you that every life is a negotiation with time. They rolled Matteo toward the OR doors that only open with a kind of sacrament, and Helena stood as close as the line on the floor would allow, her bare feet cold against tile, her pulse loud in her ears. Ethan met her gaze for half a heartbeat, the kind of silent contract that says I will do everything a human can do and then I will try to do more. She nodded once, as if blessing the attempt. The doors yawned wider and swallowed the bed, and the hallway exhaled. Outside, black SUVs arrived and cameras began to smell the air. Inside, a scalpel whispered against skin. And at the seam between those worlds, Helena Vale pressed a shaking palm to the glass and admitted to herself in a language that did not need words that secrets have a cost, and tonight the bill had arrived. The doors of the operating room sealed behind them with that heavy sigh of metal and sterility, swallowing the chaos and leaving Helena in the corridor's dim hum. The world outside the glass no longer existed. There was only the rhythm of machines and her pulse fighting to stay in sync. The silence that followed surgery is the kind that eats thought. It forces memory to replay, reshaping the past into every possible version where this night never happens. She sat, finally, folding her hands as if prayer could be coaxed out of exhaustion. The nurses passed like ghosts, purposeful and kind, pretending not to recognize her while still offering the quiet sympathy reserved for those whose hearts are currently being negotiated with death. Inside, the OR glowed like a cathedral of logic and light. Dr. Ethan Reyes stood over the table, movements deliberate, his eyes flicking between monitor and incision. Blood loss remained their enemy. The spleen had ruptured in multiple places, the liver bruised and stubbornly bleeding despite compression. There is a choreography in crisis that only those who live in it understand, one where every hand becomes both an instrument and an act of faith. He clamped, suctioned, irrigated, directed. The anesthesiologist muttered updates in a low rhythm meant to calm, but every number felt like a verdict. Matteo's heart rhythm faltered once, twice, then steadied again, as if he'd heard Helena calling from beyond the door. Ethan took it as coincidence, but something in the air disagreed. Helena tried to remember the sound of his laugh, the warmth of it echoing in the small apartment that had been theirs in secret. He used to joke that their love survived in the negative spaces between her father's meetings, between his shifts at the garage, between the headlines that never spoke their names. The world's too loud, he'd say, but we're the quiet it doesn't notice. She smiled through tears at the memory, because love remembered during crisis doesn't comfort, it condemns. It shows you the thousand ways you could have said more. When the surgeon emerged, hours later, his expression was that studied neutrality that doctors wear when balancing honesty with hope. Ethan pulled off his cap, leaving a dark mark across his forehead, and approached with the kind of gravity that bends rooms. He told her the bleeding had been controlled, the vital signs tenuous but holding, that the next 24 hours would decide the rest. Helena nodded, not trusting words, only the pulse of understanding that passed between them. Down the hall, Adrian Vale stood like an empire disguised as a man. His voice sliced through the air, measured, restrained fury. He demanded updates, access, accountability. When Helena approached, his tone softened only in public performance. He wanted to know why she was still here, why she had risked her name to protect a man who had no title to stand beside hers. But she saw something flicker, however briefly, behind his control. Fear. The kind fathers feel when the world stops obeying the order they paid for. She told him simply that she wouldn't leave, that she belonged where he was. Adrian opened his mouth to respond, but the arrival of security detail and the flash of cameras at the entrance silenced him. Power could control many things, but not truth bleeding in plain sight. Ethan watched them from a distance. He wasn't supposed to care who these people were, but medicine has a way of forcing you into their stories whether you want them or not. He saw Helena's composure hold, her eyes locked on the recovery room doors that now guarded her husband's fragile heartbeat. He thought of all the times he'd told families to prepare themselves, and how none of them ever truly could. And for reasons he didn't yet understand, he found himself silently rooting for a man he had met only as a wound. Night deepened around the hospital like a tide coming in. Lights dimmed, visitors thinned, and Helena remained in the same chair, her fingers tracing the chain around her neck. Each metallic touch recalled a vow whispered in a world small enough for honesty. She closed her eyes, not to sleep, but to anchor herself in the memory of his hands, rough with work yet gentle enough to make her believe in second chances. She whispered his name once into the sterile air, and somewhere down the hall a monitor replied with a steady, faithful beep. The IQ at dawn is a strange church. Machines hum in steady rhythms that imitate devotion, and light leaks in through narrow blinds, as if afraid to touch what has survived the night. Helena sat by Matteo's bedside, her hand resting near his, careful not to disturb the wires that tethered him to every fragile measurement of existence. His face was pale, lips cracked from the ventilator, but he was there alive in that soft, mechanical way that life sometimes insists on being. The monitors flickered quietly beside them, each green-lined like a fragile signature of his persistence. She wanted to tell him the sun had come back, that morning had kept its promise, but words felt irrelevant in a room where silence carried more weight than language ever could. Dr. Ethan Reyes entered with the cautious calm of someone who knows how hope can bruise. He checked the vitals, murmured to the nurse, adjusted the four, all with that unspoken awareness of the woman watching him from the corner. He had seen wives, lovers, daughters. Grief wears many faces, but hers carried something distinct, the burden of secrecy. When he spoke, his tone was quiet, designed to balance truth with tenderness. Matteo's condition had stabilized for now. The surgery had gone as well as it could. The danger, however, still circled the edges of the room like smoke that refused to clear. "The next few hours will tell us more," he said, and Helena only nodded, because she understood that in medicine, survival is a language spoken one heartbeat at a time. Outside, Adrian Vale's shadow moved through the corridors like a verdict. He had leveraged his influence to take control of everything: security, communications, even access to the patient's chart. He framed it as concern for his daughter's safety, but everyone understood what it meant: control the narrative before the truth learned to speak. The press had already begun whispering that the billionaire's daughter was at the hospital for a mysterious car accident. Adrian's PR team insisted it was a philanthropic visit. Helena's jaw tightened at the absurdity of it all. The man she loved was fighting for his life, and her father was crafting stories to protect the family brand. Ethan found her later in the small chapel near the north wing. Hospitals have chapels the way oceans have quiet coves, places where brokenness can be acknowledged without permission. Helena sat in the front pew, the glow of a single candle illuminating her face. She didn't notice when he entered, or maybe she did and didn't care. When he spoke, it wasn't as a doctor but as a man who had spent too many nights watching people lose everything. He told her that grief has a way of teaching us who we are willing to become. She didn't answer at first, just turned the ring on her chain between her fingers. Finally, she whispered that she didn't know how to grieve in public, that the world expected her to look untouched. Ethan said softly that pretending to be fine is the most exhausting form of dying. Their silence afterward felt strangely intimate. Two people bound by proximity to pain, each understanding that some truths can't be spoken while the body you love is still connected to machines. When he left, Helena looked at the candle again and realized something both terrifying and beautiful: she had no control anymore. The lies she had built to protect her secret marriage were unraveling, thread by thread, under the weight of her own heartbeat. Hours later, as the afternoon light folded over the hospital like a tired hand, Matteo stirred. His eyelids fluttered, then closed again. It wasn't consciousness yet, just the body remembering what it means to return. Helena leaned forward, her breath catching in disbelief. A single tear escaped before she could stop it. She whispered his name, and for the first time, the monitor's rhythm seemed to quicken as if some part of him recognized her presence through the haze of sedation. Behind the glass, Ethan watched the scene, aware that the quiet between heartbeats can hold more meaning than any medical explanation. He noted the vitals, wrote down the time, and told the nurse to document that the patient had responded to voice. But what he didn't write, what no chart could capture, was that something alive had passed between them, something deeper than survival. And as night began to gather again, the hospital lights dimming into that tired blue twilight, Helena stayed where she was, whispering fragments of a love story that had lived too long in the dark. She didn't know who she'd have to face when morning came: her father, the press, the world, but in that moment, she didn't care. The only truth that mattered was the faint, steady sound beside her. Matteo's heart, still beating, still choosing her, one fragile pulse at a time. Morning came quietly, as if the world itself was afraid to wake him. The IQ smelled of antiseptic and metal, and Helena had stopped noticing both. She sat there still, her hand close to his, her eyes half closed but unwilling to rest. For the first time in 20 hours, the monitor beside Matteo drew a calm, even rhythm, and the fluorescent lights softened to the color of milk. Nurses passed with their quiet efficiency, drips were changed, notes written, and somewhere far down the corridor a phone rang endlessly into nothing. It was the kind of dawn hospitals specialize in, the kind that asks for patience rather than celebration. Dr. Ethan Riz entered again, his white coat faintly wrinkled, the fatigue in his face neatly folded behind professionalism. He asked her to step outside so they could adjust the ventilator and begin weaning. She stood reluctantly, feeling the chair's shape still pressed into her legs. In the hallway the air felt too open, too bright. Ethan explained in that careful voice that the surgery's success didn't end the danger. Infection, organ failure, or simply the exhaustion of a wounded body could still steal what they'd saved. But then he added something softer, almost private: he's fighting hard. People like him usually do. Helena nodded, swallowing the gratitude she couldn't speak aloud. When she returned to the waiting area, her father was there again, sitting as if the chair owed him comfort. Adrian Vale did not belong to rooms that offered no control. His voice was low, measured, a performance of concern practiced for shareholders and news anchors alike. He told her that arrangements had been made for transfer to a private facility, that the doctors would be compensated, that discretion was being ensured. She listened without moving. Finally she asked, quietly, "Do you even know who he is, father?" He hesitated just long enough for her to see the truth. He didn't care to know, only to erase. Helena felt something shift inside her then, not rage, not defiance, but the clarity that follows a long fever. She realized that for all his power, her father had never learned the simplest thing about her: that love had given her a courage he would never purchase. She told him the transfer wouldn't happen, that Matteo would stay here until Ethan said otherwise. Adrian's jaw hardened, his eyes narrowing into the shape of command, but she stood her ground, and the silence that followed was the first victory of her adult life. Inside the room, Matteo drifted between worlds. Sedation had thinned into uneasy dreams, headlights exploding in rain, glass turning to water, Helena's scream woven into the noise. In that dream he kept reaching for her hand and finding only air. Somewhere, faintly, the beeping of the monitor began to shape itself into rhythm again, steady as a heartbeat returning from exile. When Ethan came by in the afternoon, he found Helena reading aloud from the small book she'd pulled from her purse, a worn collection of poems she used to keep by his bedside. Her voice was low, uneven, but the words filled the sterile room with something resembling life. He paused at the doorway, unseen for a moment, and wondered how many stories like this the hospital carried each day, how much love hid behind curtains and case numbers. He didn't believe in miracles, but he believed in people who refused to give up, and that was almost the same thing. Helena closed the book and reached to brush a strand of hair from Matteo's forehead. "You promised me forever," she whispered, half to him, half to herself. And as if answering, a faint movement stirred beneath her fingers, the smallest twitch of his hand, deliberate and alive. Her breath caught. Ethan saw it too. He moved quickly to check the vitals, heart rate climbing, oxygen stable. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make everyone in the room pause. Helena looked at the doctor, at the man who had held his life together with precision and quiet faith. "He heard me," she said. Ethan only nodded, because sometimes belief is the best medicine you can give. That night, as the city outside glowed with the careless wealth of skyscrapers and neon, the hospital kept its humble light steady. In a private room guarded by secrecy and love, a woman who had once been the world's heiress became something far rarer: a wife waiting for her husband to come back from the edge. And for the first time, she felt no shame in who she was. Only the slow, holy fear of what it means to truly love someone who might still die. Night returned like a confession, soft and endless, wrapping the hospital in its quiet pulse. The windows glowed faintly, reflecting the silver of passing ambulances and the restless hum of the city beyond. Helena hadn't left his side. The monitors were her clock now, the rise and fall of numbers her only measure of time. Matteo lay beneath a thin blanket, the scars of surgery stark against his skin, but the color had returned faintly to his lips, a ghost of the man she'd married in secret. She whispered to him, stories they had once told under the anonymity of small-town stars about their first kiss in the rain, the cheap motel where they'd laughed until dawn, the dream of building a home without names, without cameras. She spoke not to wake him, but to remind herself that he was still here. Dr. Ethan Reyes entered quietly, chart in hand, his eyes catching the dim reflection of monitors and moonlight. He had learned to move gently around love. It was more delicate than sutures, more unpredictable than arrhythmia. He's showing progress, he murmured. His kidneys are responding, pressure's stable. We might try removing the tube tomorrow. Helena exhaled in a sound that was half prayer, half disbelief. Ethan smiled, the kind of smile doctors reserve for moments when medicine finally bends toward mercy. He lingered for a moment, watching her brush her thumb along Matteo's hand, and he felt the familiar ache of witnessing love he could never claim as his own. Outside, the hospital continued its routine ballet of tragedy and endurance. Somewhere, a code was called, somewhere else, a newborn cried. Helena's world, however, had narrowed to a single bed. She leaned closer and spoke softly, not knowing if he could hear. They don't know about us, she whispered. But that doesn't make us less real. Her tears slipped silently down her face, tracing the exhaustion of sleepless nights and the grief she hadn't yet earned the right to show. Ethan's pager buzzed a new emergency, a reminder that duty doesn't wait for closure. Before leaving, he told her that Matteo's fight was his own now, that love had done its part and the rest belonged to the body's stubborn will. Helena nodded, watching him go, suddenly aware that she trusted this man not just with her husband's life, but with the fragments of her secret. In a world built on money and lies, that felt like something sacred. When Ethan reached the trauma bay, another patient was arriving, another story already writing itself. But part of him stayed behind in that room, where a woman's love had made the sterile air feel almost holy. Around midnight, the hospital quieted into the kind of stillness that amplifies every sound, the ticking for pump, the sigh of ventilation, the heartbeat that refused to give up. Helena rested her head on Matteo's arm, exhaustion finally dragging her into a shallow, fragile sleep. In the half-dream that followed, she saw him standing at the edge of a lake, sunlight breaking behind him, his hand reaching out. When she woke, tears were already on her cheeks. She looked at him, then at the monitor, steady and bright, and whispered, "Don't you dare stop." Outside, the first light of morning began to touch the horizon. For the first time since the crash, Helena allowed herself to believe in the ordinary miracle of survival. She sat back, fingers still entwined with his, unaware that the next sunrise would bring consequences no prayer could delay, because secrets, even those born in love, don't stay sleeping forever. By sunrise, the hospital had resumed its usual rhythm, the beeping, the footsteps, the calm urgency of life continuing. But for Helena, everything had shifted. She was no longer the hidden wife sitting quietly beside a wounded man. She was a secret on the edge of exposure. The night's peace had given her something dangerous, the illusion that they were safe. It vanished the moment she saw the journalists crowding outside the emergency entrance, microphones like weapons, cameras waiting to devour the story before it even breathed. Her father's men were already there, security in tailored suits, rehearsed smiles masking the desperation of containment. Adrian Vale had arrived again, not as a father, but as a general who had discovered betrayal within his own bloodline. Helena rose as he entered the ICU corridor, his eyes a storm of disbelief. "Tell me it isn't true," he said quietly, too quietly, as though the walls themselves might report him. She didn't speak. Silence, in that moment, was confession enough. The ring on her chain caught the light as she stood, and his gaze fell upon it like a blade finding its mark. "You married him," he said, not a question, but an accusation. "A mechanic. You, the daughter of Adrian Vale." His voice cracked on his own name, the sound of a man watching his legacy fracture. She wanted to explain, to tell him that love had nothing to do with names or fortunes or press releases. That Matteo had seen her when she was simply a woman, not an empire. But her father didn't want truth, he wanted obedience. His hand trembled as he gestured toward the door. End this, Helena. Walk away before it ruins everything. And she, exhausted and unarmored, whispered, "It already has. But it's the first thing that's ever been real." Dr. Ethan Ray's approached mid-confrontation, the air thick with the clash of privilege and pain. He interceded only to protect his patient's peace. "Mr. Vale," he said evenly, "this is an intensive care unit, not a boardroom. If you want to yell, find somewhere that isn't surrounded by machines keeping your son-in-law alive." The words hung there like electricity, irrefutable and dangerous. Adrian froze, the weight of them turning the blood in his face pale. Helena looked at Ethan then, the gratitude in her eyes almost breaking her. For weeks she had lived divided between two worlds, duty and love, and, for the first time, someone had chosen to defend the latter without asking for a price. Her father left without another word, his retreat a promise of vengeance rather than surrender. Inside the room, Matteo stirred. The sedation had faded further now, his eyelids fluttering with the fragile awareness of someone halfway between dreams and waking. Helena leaned closer, whispering his name like a secret prayer. His fingers moved just barely, and then, slowly, his eyes opened. Confusion at first, then light, then her face, blurred but unmistakable. She saw the recognition bloom, the relief and disbelief mixing into a single trembling breath. He tried to speak, but she hushed him gently, her forehead touching his. "You came back," she whispered. Ethan stepped in, checking the monitors, his voice calm but his heart racing. "Easy. Don't strain. You've been through hell." Matteo blinked, then focused on Helena again. His voice, cracked and small, found its way out. "I thought I lost you." Tears fell freely down her face now, no cameras, no disguise, just truth, raw and merciful. For a brief moment, even the machine seemed to quiet, as though giving the lovers room to exist. Ethan backed away, giving them that fragile space. He had seen recoveries before, but rarely ones that rewrote the people involved. He thought of the word miracle again, not as something divine, but as the moment when a human being decides to keep living for someone else. When Helena stepped into the hallway later, she saw her father's car waiting outside, black and gleaming like a threat. She didn't look twice. She walked past it, barefoot, exhausted, and fearless, toward the small window at the end of the corridor where the morning light had begun to spill in. Behind her, Matteo slept. Ahead of her, the truth waited, wild, uncontrollable, but hers. By evening, the hospital had become a battlefield of whispers. News outlets had confirmed what her father feared most, that the man in the ICU was not just an unnamed crash victim, but the secret husband of Helena Vale. Cameras gathered like vultures at the front gate, their flashes slicing through glass. Hospital staff walked faster, speaking softer, as though silence could undo exposure. Helena watched it unfold from the small visitor's window, her reflection trembling between worlds, one she was born into and one she chose. For the first time, she didn't run from either. Dr. Ethan Ray's found her there, the light of dusk folding around them. He told her the medical updates in his usual composed tone: blood work improving, lungs recovering, sedation being lifted, but even his voice carried a trace of awe. "He's stronger than I expected," he said quietly. She smiled faintly. "He always has been. He just never had anyone who believed it." Ethan hesitated, then asked gently, "And what about you? What happens when the world finds out?" Helena looked out the window, her hands clasped. "Then I stop hiding," she said. "Let them know. Let them see what love looks like when it costs everything." Downstairs, Adrian Vale faced the media. Cameras blinked like judgment, microphones demanded penance, and every sentence he spoke was a performance balancing outrage with control. He framed her marriage as a private emotional matter, refusing to confirm or deny details, but the denial in his eyes was louder than any headline. Inside, his daughter was choosing differently. She was learning to live without pretending. When Ethan returned to Matteo's room later that night, Helena was there again, reading softly, her voice tracing the edges of love and survival. Matteo's eyes were open now, pale but alive, the mechanical rhythm replaced by fragile human breath. He looked at her as if she were light itself. His fingers sought hers weakly, and when he spoke, the words came slowly, shaped by pain but carried by relief. "You stayed," he said. "Always," she whispered back. For a moment, the hospital fell away, the sound of machines, the footsteps, even time itself. There was only the weight of their hands together and the truth that no secret could bury this kind of devotion. Ethan stood at the door, silent, bearing witness to the kind of love that doesn't need blessing, only endurance. He thought again of how medicine teaches you to fix bodies, but never how to mend lives, and yet, sometimes, one happens because of the other. Outside, the world buzzed with speculation and outrage. Inside, a man began to breathe on his own for the first time in days. Helena leaned close, her tears landing softly on his skin. "You're safe now," she murmured. "No more hiding, no more lies." Matteo smiled weakly, his eyes heavy but sure. "Then we start again," he said. She nodded, and for the first time since the crash, the fear in her chest gave way to something larger: peace. Ethan switched off the last machine, his voice calm but reverent. "He doesn't need this one anymore," he said. Helena exhaled, her body trembling, her faith vindicated by the steady rhythm of life returning. Outside, chaos reigned. Inside, two people rebuilt the world from the smallest thing that still worked, the heartbeat that refused to stop. As dawn approached once more, Helena sat beside her husband, no longer hiding the ring, no longer fearing the eyes that would follow. She had learned that love is not meant to survive in silence, it's meant to be seen, even when it burns. The morning after the storm broke, the city looked different, quieter, as though even the sky had paused to listen. The headlines had already devoured the truth. Billionaire's daughter secretly married mechanic, husband nearly dies in crash, but Helena didn't read them. The world outside those hospital walls could shout and speculate all it wanted. Inside, she had learned that love was not a scandal, it was survival. Matteo was sitting up now, pale but alive, sunlight spreading across his face through the blinds. His voice was still fragile, each word a small victory against what had tried to silence him. When she entered the room, he smiled, slow, tired, but real, and reached for her hand. "You look different," he whispered. She laughed softly, brushing away the tears she didn't bother to hide. "I finally stopped pretending." They sat together in that fragile peace, and for a while the machines, the chaos, and the world itself disappeared. Love had been their secret, now it was their freedom. The ring that once hid beneath her dress now shone opally on her hand, simple and honest, its gold dulled by sleepless nights but made sacred by what they had endured. Ethan came in quietly, the calm weight of relief still in his shoulders. He checked Matteo's vitals, nodded once, and smiled, that rare kind of smile born from witnessing someone win a battle that medicine alone could never guarantee. "You're going to be fine," he said. "Just don't rush it." Matteo looked at him with the kind of gratitude words can't hold. "Thank you," he said. Ethan only replied, "You did the hard part." But his gaze lingered on Helena, seeing in her the same fierce grace he had come to admire, the kind that heals by refusing to give up. Later, when Helena stepped outside for the first time in days, the air tasted new. The reporters still waited beyond the gates, their voices sharp with hunger for spectacle. But as she walked past them, hand in hand with Matteo, the noise dulled. The cameras flashed, but she didn't flinch. For the first time, she wanted the world to see, not the billionaire's daughter, not the scandal, but the truth, that love, when stripped of luxury and lies, was the one thing neither money nor power could command. Her father watched from a distance, his expression unreadable behind dark glass. There was anger, yes, but also something he could never admit: respect. She had done what he never could, chosen something he couldn't control. And in that choice, she had inherited more than his fortune, she had inherited herself. That night, back in the quiet of Matteo's room, the monitors hummed softly, like an orchestra playing only for them. She lay beside him carefully, her head resting on his shoulder, their breaths finally matching. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and rebirth. "Do you ever wish we'd done it differently?" he asked. Helena smiled faintly. "No, because every secret, every lie, led me here, to this moment, to you." The lights dimmed to gold, the machines slowed their song, and for the first time since the crash, there was peace, not the kind you beg for, but the kind you earn. Outside, the world argued about love and power and forgiveness. Inside, two hearts found their own definition of forever, one heartbeat, one breath, one truth at a time.